Have you ever met someone who believed they were untouchable, so proud, so sure that faith and kindness were only for the weak? In a quiet corner of suburban Georgia, behind the gates of a mansion that gleamed with luxury, lived a woman named Victoria Hayes. To her neighbors, she was the picture of success, elegant, powerful, always in control. But behind those perfect glass doors, another story was unfolding, one that would test the limits of pride, humility, and divine grace. Every morning, before the sun had even risen, Grace Miller arrived at Victoria's doorstep. Grace was her maid, humble, soft-spoken, and deeply faithful. While Victoria's life glittered with wealth, Grace's world was simple: a small apartment, a worn Bible, and a heart that believed in prayer more than anything money could buy. To Victoria, that faith seemed foolish, almost laughable. "You really think God listens to you?" she'd sneer, her voice dripping with disdain as Grace polished the marble floors or set breakfast on the table. What Victoria didn't know was that the same woman she mocked every day was quietly praying for her, not out of pity, not out of fear, but out of compassion. Grace had learned that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who need prayer the most. Still, the humiliation cut deep. Each insult was another wound carried in silence. And yet, every night, Grace knelt beside her bed, whispering words of forgiveness, asking God to bless the very person who saw her as less than human. Have you ever been through this, where someone's arrogance tries to crush your spirit and all you can do is hold on to your faith? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This isn't just a story about cruelty and injustice. It's about what happens when grace meets pride head-on. Victoria's mansion may have been filled with everything money could buy, but it lacked the one thing she couldn't control: peace. Her laughter at Grace's prayers masked something darker, a deep loneliness, a restless emptiness she couldn't explain. Her teenage son Ethan had grown distant, and her husband was always away on business. The home she had built as a symbol of success had become a prison of silence. And still every morning Grace would smile and say, "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," as if yesterday's insults never happened. Sometimes Victoria wondered how she could stand it, how she could still smile after so much humiliation. What kind of strength came from believing in something unseen? It's strange, isn't it, how life has a way of turning pride into dust and humility into power. Because one evening, when the walls of that mansion could no longer hide the cracks in Victoria's heart, everything changed. Tragedy came without warning, shattering the illusion of control she had built her life upon. When her world began to crumble, there was no one left to call, no friends who truly cared, no family who could fix what was broken. Only one person still whispered her name in prayer, the maid she had mocked. And that's where this story truly begins. Because sometimes it's not the powerful who save the weak, it's the humble who remind the powerful of what grace really means. What happens next will test the limits of faith and forgiveness in a way neither woman could have imagined. And maybe you've seen something like this before, where pride builds a wall so high that only pain can break it down. Maybe you've worked for someone, like Victoria, someone who thought humility was weakness and kindness was something to be bought. Or maybe, at some point in your life, you've been a little like her yourself, chasing control, forgetting that peace doesn't live in wealth or power, but in gratitude and grace. If this story is already stirring something inside you, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this touches your heart the most. Have you ever met someone who needed to learn the hard way what humility really means? Your story, your words, might be exactly what someone else out there needs to read tonight. That's how these stories live on, not just through the video, but through the voices of people like you who believe that faith and compassion still matter. And if you're feeling that quiet pull in your chest, the one that says you understand Grace, or maybe even Victoria, don't just keep it to yourself. Click the like button, not as a habit, but as a small act of support for this kind of storytelling. Every like helps this message of faith, redemption, and forgiveness reach another person who might be losing hope right now. If you're new here, I invite you to subscribe. This isn't just another channel. It's a growing community of hearts that believe goodness still wins, even in the darkest moments. Each story we share is a reminder that God works through the humble, through the broken, through those who refuse to give up on grace. By subscribing, you help keep these messages alive. You become part of something that spreads light where it's needed most, because when one story of faith is shared, another heart finds healing. And maybe, just maybe, the next story could be yours. Now, as tragedy strikes and Victoria's world begins to crumble, everything she once mocked will be the very thing that saves her. Stay with me. What happens next will show just how powerful a single prayer can be. The days inside that mansion followed a rhythm that never changed, a rhythm of command and obedience, of silence and superiority. Victoria Hayes walked through her marble hallways like a queen ruling her kingdom, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, echoing authority and distance. Grace Miller, always a few steps behind, carried a quiet strength that Victoria couldn't understand. Every morning, she'd arrive early, her hands already rough from years of work, her mind anchored in prayer. While the rest of the house slept, Grace was awake, ironing linen sheets, preparing coffee just the way Victoria liked it, and arranging fresh flowers in the entryway. She moved like someone who understood that small acts of care could carry great meaning, even when unseen. But for Victoria, those gestures were invisible. To her, Grace was just another employee, another name on a paycheck, someone meant to serve, not to feel. Grace, Victoria's voice would slice through the quiet like a knife. You missed a spot. I swear I don't know how hard it can be to do one. Simple thing, right? Grace would lower her eyes. I'm sorry, Ma'am, I'll fix it right away. Victoria scoffed. Maybe if you spent less time praying and more time cleaning, you'd get it right the first time. The words were cruel, but Grace never reacted. Instead, she whispered something under her breath, soft, steady, like a secret melody. It wasn't defiance, it was prayer. Lord, help me stay calm. Help me serve with love, even when I'm hurt. In another world, that whisper might have gone unheard, but sometimes even in the coldest rooms, heaven listens. The mansion had a strange atmosphere, grand but hollow. Expensive art lined the walls, but none of it felt alive. The servants moved like shadows, careful not to disturb the peace that wasn't really peace at all. Victoria's wealth had built her a fortress, but it was one made of glass, beautiful to look at, fragile to the touch. Her arrogance wasn't just pride, it was protection, a defense against her own emptiness. Grace, on the other hand, carried peace in her silence. Her humility wasn't weakness, it was armor. Even when Victoria demanded impossible tasks, scrubbing floors already spotless, redoing chores just to feel control, Grace obeyed without complaint. But each time she was belittled, she responded the same way, by praying for the woman who despised her. There was something unexplainable in that faith. In a world that teaches us to fight back, Grace chose to surrender, not to Victoria, but to God. That quiet surrender gave her a kind of inner power that Victoria could sense but couldn't name, and maybe that was what irritated her most. One evening, after a long day filled with small humiliations, Victoria found Grace still working in the kitchen long past her shift. "You're still here?" she asked coldly, sipping her wine. "No one's paying you for overtime." Grace smiled gently. "I just wanted to finish the dishes. I like to leave things clean before I go." Victoria tilted her head, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Is that your secret to happiness, Grace? Washing away your problems?" Grace hesitated, her voice soft but steady. "No, Ma'am. My secret is knowing I'm not alone when I face them." For a second, Victoria said nothing. The words hung in the air like perfume, subtle but impossible to ignore. She turned away, pretending not to care, but something about that answer stayed with her long after Grace had left. There's a hidden truth in people like Grace, something unshakable that doesn't come from circumstance, but from conviction. She didn't have much, but she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew her worth came from above, not from the world around her. Her life was a lesson in transformation, how pain can refine the heart instead of hardening it, how faith can turn humiliation into strength. But for Victoria, humility looked like defeat. She couldn't see beyond her own reflection, the designer clothes, the luxury cars, the social circles that praised her. Success. She thought faith was a fairy tale for the desperate, something people used to survive failure. And yet, behind that certainty, there was fear. Fear of losing control, of facing the emptiness behind her perfection. At night, when the mansion fell silent, Victoria would pour herself another glass of wine and stare at the city lights from her balcony. In those moments, the confidence she wore during the day began to crack. Her husband was away again. Her son barely spoke to her, and the laughter she once found in power had turned into noise she couldn't bear. She'd tell herself she didn't need anyone, but deep down she felt the isolation closing in. Meanwhile, Grace walked home to her small apartment on the other side of town. Her furniture was simple, her pay barely enough, but her home felt alive. There were photos of her daughter Leela on the wall, a few verses from Psalms taped near the door, and a quiet warmth that no luxury could replace. Before bed, she'd kneel beside her. Worn couch, close her eyes, and whisper names into the dark. Victoria's among them. Lord, please watch over her. I know she's hurting, even if she doesn't see it. Help her find peace. That prayer, born out of compassion rather than anger, carried more power than anyone in that mansion could have imagined. Sometimes faith isn't loud. It doesn't shout or demand attention. It endures, steady as a heartbeat, waiting for the right moment to reveal its strength. Grace didn't know that her quiet prayers were planting seeds in soil that seemed barren, seeds that would only bloom when tragedy shattered the walls of pride that kept Victoria from seeing the truth. And still, the days repeated. Victoria's criticisms became routine, almost predictable. "You call this coffee? My son won't drink that," she'd complain, pushing the cup away. "Do it again." Grace would nod, take the cup, and brew another without a word. There was no bitterness in her eyes, just patience, as if she knew something. Victoria didn't. The power dynamic between them looked unbreakable from the outside, but life has a way of rearranging hierarchies. Behind every moment of cruelty, there's a hidden story, a wound, a fear, a blind spot. Victoria's arrogance wasn't just about class or control. It was about survival. She had spent so long pretending to be perfect that she no longer remembered how to be human. And Grace? She had learned that love wasn't a feeling. It was a decision. Every time she prayed for Victoria, it was a small act of rebellion against hate, a reminder that goodness isn't weakness, it's courage. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Victoria was particularly cruel. The storm outside mirrored the one in her heart. "You think your prayers mean something?" she snapped, watching Grace wipe the windows. "If prayer worked, you wouldn't be stuck cleaning my house for a living." Grace stopped for a moment, her reflection blurred in the glass. She turned slowly and said almost in a whisper, "Prayer doesn't always change our circumstances, ma'am, but it changes us." Victoria rolled her eyes, but something in her expression softened, just for a heartbeat, before pride rebuilt the wall again. "Spare me the sermon, Grace. Just finish the job." But that moment lingered like a splinter beneath her polished composure. Later that night, when she looked into her mirror, she couldn't escape the echo of Grace's words. "It changes us." It's strange how truth finds its way into the hardest hearts, slipping through cracks of fatigue and loneliness. Even Victoria, who thought she was above everyone else, couldn't silence that small voice inside her anymore. It wasn't guilt yet, not fully, but something was shifting, slowly, quietly. Change often starts that way, behind the scenes, in moments no one notices. It's in the way a cruel word loses its power, or a hardened heart hesitates before striking again. Transformation doesn't announce itself. It unfolds like dawn after a long night. And while Victoria's mansion still gleamed on the outside, something inside it had begun to flicker, a light faint but persistent, waiting for the storm that would force it to shine brighter. Because when tragedy finally came, it would tear down everything she thought she knew about power, control, and faith. And in the ruins of her pride, she would discover the one truth Grace had lived all along, that sometimes the most powerful prayers come from the most wounded hearts. The rain was falling softly over the small apartment complex on the outskirts of Atlanta, its rhythmic sound tapping against the window like a quiet reminder that even storms have their own kind of peace. Grace Miller stepped inside, her body weary from the long day, her hands sore, her spirit tired, but not broken. The moment she closed the door, the chaos of the mansion faded away. Here, in her modest one-bedroom home, there was stillness. The air smelled faintly of lavender and home-cooked meals, and a small lamp cast a warm glow over the room. On her nightstand, next to an old photo of her late husband, lay her worn Bible, its edges frayed from years of use. She set her bag down, kicked off her worn shoes, and took a deep breath, whispering a simple prayer before saying a word to anyone. "Thank you, Lord, for getting me through another day." It wasn't a grand declaration, just gratitude, quiet and sincere. Her voice trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes when life keeps testing your patience and faith at the same time. Her teenage daughter, Lila, peeked out from the small kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Mom, you're home late again." Grace smiled softly. "Mrs. Hayes had some last-minute guests. You know how it is." Lila frowned, walking closer. "She's always making you stay late. You should quit, Mom. You deserve better than that." Grace sat on the edge of the bed, the faint creak of the springs filling the room. "I know, baby, but sometimes God puts us in places we don't understand, because He's working something out we can't see yet." Lila crossed her arms, frustrated. "I just don't get why you keep praying for that woman. She treats you like you're invisible." Grace looked at her daughter, her eyes calm but full of depth. "Because God loved me when I didn't deserve it either. And maybe, just maybe, He's asking me to show her the same grace." There was silence for a moment, the kind of silence that holds weight, not emptiness. Lila didn't respond, but she sat beside her mother, resting her head on her shoulder. Grace wrapped her arm around her, both of them watching the rain trail down the window pane like tiny rivers carrying unseen stories. Behind every act of kindness lies a decision, a mindset that doesn't come naturally in a world built on pride and reaction. Grace's faith wasn't blind. It was a deliberate choice she made every day. She understood something Victoria never could. That strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, it kneels, it forgives, it endures when the world expects you to break. When she opened her Bible that night, the thin pages rustled softly. She didn't read long passages or search for complicated meaning. Her eyes landed on a single verse, one she had underlined years ago. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." She smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "That's the only way through," she murmured to herself. "It's easy to think of faith as something grand, something miraculous that only shows up when the sky splits open. But for Grace, faith was found in the small, ordinary acts of the everyday. The decision to pray instead of curse, to forgive instead of resent, to show up with a humble heart even when the world rewarded arrogance. It was that quiet consistency, that daily surrender, that made her different. She closed her Bible and folded her hands again. Her prayer wasn't eloquent, but it was honest. "Father, please give me strength to keep my heart soft. Help me see her the way you see her." There was something sacred in that moment, though no one else could see it. The kind of transformation that happens behind the scenes, unseen by the world, but deeply known by heaven. It wasn't about asking for life to get easier. It was about becoming strong enough to keep loving, even when it didn't. Lila watched her mother and whispered, "Do you really think people like Mrs. Hayes can change?" Grace smiled gently, her eyes still closed. "Everyone can change, sweetheart. Sometimes it just takes a little suffering to open a hard heart." That sentence lingered in the room long after the words faded. It wasn't a lesson spoken from a place of comfort. It was truth earned through pain. Grace knew the cost of faith. She'd lost her husband to illness, fought to raise her daughter alone, worked jobs that took more than they gave. But through all of it, she had never stopped believing that goodness still mattered, that prayer still reached places she couldn't. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria sat in her bedroom with a glass of red wine, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman looking back at her was flawless. Perfect hair, perfect skin, perfect posture. But her eyes betrayed something hollow. Behind the expensive perfume and practiced smile was a woman running from herself. The same house that screamed luxury had grown silent, suffocating in its emptiness. She glanced at her phone. No new messages. Her husband was still on a business trip. Her son hadn't come home yet. She scrolled aimlessly through social media, watching other people's joy, their families, their laughter. For a moment, she envied what she couldn't buy: peace. It's strange how life balances itself. Grace had little but carried peace in her heart. Victoria had everything but couldn't sleep at night. Two women, worlds apart in class and circumstance, were walking the same unseen journey, one of transformation and revelation. One searching for meaning through prayer, the other trying to fill a void that luxury never could. Grace's faith was quiet but contagious. It had a ripple effect, though Victoria couldn't see it yet. The way Grace looked at her, the patience she carried, it wasn't submission. It was strength, disguised as humility. And sometimes it takes being near someone truly grounded in faith to recognize just how lost we are. Later that night, Grace prepared a simple dinner for Lila: cornbread, soup, and sweet tea, the kind of meal that nourished more than the body. As they ate, Grace listened to her daughter talk about school, about dreams of studying nursing, about wanting to move somewhere new. "You will, baby," Grace said. "Just don't lose your heart along the way. The world will try to take it, but don't let it." Lila looked at her mother and smiled. "You sound like a preacher," Grace laughed softly. "No, honey. Just someone who's learned the hard way that kindness is never wasted." After dinner, Grace stepped outside for a moment. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet earth and renewal. She looked up at the cloudy sky, her heart heavy but full. Every night ended the same way, with her choosing hope again. And maybe that's what faith really is. Not certainty, not comfort, but the decision to trust even when nothing makes sense. It's what kept her grounded, what made her resilient in the face of cruelty. Because Grace knew that one day, in God's time, every seed of kindness would bear fruit, even if she never got to see it bloom. The next morning, before dawn, she tied her hair back, packed her lunch, and headed to the bus stop. The city was still asleep, the streets damp from last night's storm. She looked up at the faint blush of sunrise and whispered, "Thank you for another chance to do good." There was no bitterness in her tone, only purpose. At that same hour, in the mansion miles away, Victoria sat alone at her kitchen table, staring at the untouched breakfast her staff had prepared. For reasons she couldn't explain, she thought about Grace, the way she smiled after being insulted, the way she seemed to carry peace wherever she went. The thought irritated her, but it also stirred something deeper, something she didn't have a name for yet. It's fascinating how divine connections work, how one person's prayer can begin another's transformation without a word being spoken. Grace had no idea her quiet faith was already working behind the scenes, softening the very heart she prayed for. And in the coming days, as trials began to unfold, that invisible thread between the two women would tighten. The hidden truth about faith, humility, and the impact of simple kindness was about to be revealed in ways neither of them could predict. The journey toward grace had already begun. It just hadn't yet reached the moment that would test everything they believed about love, forgiveness, and divine justice. The mansion that looked like perfection from the outside was in truth a place of quiet ruin. Every polished marble surface reflected an illusion Victoria Hayes had spent years perfecting, a life where everything glittered, where every detail was curated, every emotion neatly tucked away behind control and luxury. She had mastered the art of appearing fulfilled. The neighbors admired her, the women at her country club envied her, and even her social media presence told a story of effortless success. But when the last light went out at night and silence filled the long hallways, the truth began to whisper through the walls. Victoria sat by her grand piano, an untouched glass of wine beside her, scrolling aimlessly through her phone. Her husband, Charles, was in New York again for business, and her son, Ethan, hadn't come home yet. The clock ticked softly, a reminder that time, no matter how much money she had, was one thing she couldn't buy back. When she finally called Ethan's phone, it went straight to voicemail. "Ethan, it's your mother," she said, her tone sharp, more controlling than concerned. "Call me when you hear this. I don't care what time it is." She ended the call with a sigh that carried exhaustion she wouldn't dare admit. She had once believed that being in control was the same as being safe, that discipline and money could keep her life predictable. But control had turned into a prison. Behind every successful woman, people said, was discipline and drive. Yet no one ever mentioned what happens when those become armor, when power becomes the only language you know how to speak. Her reflection in the piano lid caught her off guard. The woman staring back was beautiful, yes, but also tired. There was a hardness around her eyes that hadn't always been there. She remembered a time when laughter had come easily, when she'd believed in something greater than herself. But those days felt like they belonged to someone else. Somewhere along the way, she had traded meaning for achievement, love for status, faith for control. It was easier to mock belief than to face the possibility that she'd lost hers long ago. That's why Grace's faith irritated her so deeply. It wasn't the praying itself. It was the peace it seemed to bring, the calm, the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing, yet walked as if she owned the world. Victoria couldn't understand it, and that lack of understanding felt like weakness, so she laughed. "Childish hope," she called it once, when Grace whispered a prayer before cleaning the dining room. "You really believe there's someone listening up there?" Victoria asked, her voice laced with mockery. Grace didn't look up from the table she was polishing. "Yes, ma'am, I do," Victoria smirked. "Then tell him to help you clean faster." Grace smiled, faintly unfazed. "He already helps me with patience." The reply lingered in the air long after Victoria walked away. She didn't like that answer, not because it was defiant, but because it was true. There was a kind of authority in humility that she couldn't fight against. It was the one thing her money couldn't buy, and deep down, she knew it. That night, Victoria lay awake beside an empty space in her bed where Charles should have been. The quiet was oppressive, like the air before a storm. Her phone buzzed briefly. A text from her husband. "Working late. Don't wait up." No explanation, no affection, just routine. She put the phone face down and stared at the ceiling. In the darkness, her mind wandered. She thought of her father's small church in rural Alabama, where she'd once sung in the choir as a girl. She remembered the hymns, the wooden pews, the warmth of her mother's hands during prayer. It was a simpler life, a poorer one, but it had been real. She hadn't thought about those memories in years. Now they came back like ghosts. It's strange how the soul remembers what the mind tries to bury. Her wealth had insulated her from the discomfort of faith. Faith demanded surrender, and surrender was something Victoria had forgotten how to do. She'd built her empire brick by brick, an empire of reputation, of success, of control. Yet each achievement brought less satisfaction than the last. It was like drinking from an empty cup, appearance without substance. In her own way, Victoria was just as enslaved as Grace. But where Grace's chains were visible, Victoria's were gold. At breakfast the next morning, Ethan sat across from her, scrolling on his phone. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the clink of silverware. "Did you study for your chemistry test?" she asked, her tone more interrogative than maternal. Ethan shrugged. Yeah, she repeated, arching an eyebrow. "You mean yes, mother?" He didn't look up. "Sure," Victoria exhaled sharply. "Ethan, look at me when I speak to you." He did, briefly, with eyes that mirrored her own, but colder. "What do you want me to say, Mom? You're never happy anyway." The words hit harder than she expected. For a second she froze. He went back to scrolling, and she said nothing. It was easier to retreat than to confront what that sentence meant. When he left for school, she stood by the window watching him go, her arms crossed tightly. "You'll thank me one day," she whispered, though there was no conviction behind it. Later that afternoon, she hosted a small luncheon for a few women from her charity board. The dining table gleamed, the silver polished to perfection. Grace moved quietly in the background, refilling glasses and serving dishes. The women talked about vacations, fashion, and their husbands' promotions. The laughter was loud but hollow. At one point, Victoria's friend Marilyn leaned in and said, "Your maid is so devoted. She's been smiling the whole time." Victoria forced a laugh. "Devoted or delusional, I can't tell the difference." The women laughed politely, but Grace didn't flinch. She simply continued serving, her expression calm, her movements graceful. That composure unsettled Victoria more than any insult could. When the guests left, Victoria found herself pacing the living room. She should have felt triumphant. The party had gone perfectly. Instead, she felt restless, empty again. It was as though the laughter of her guests had stripped the house of oxygen. She caught sight of Grace cleaning the dining table. "You really don't get tired of smiling, do you?" Grace looked up, her eyes kind. "Smiling doesn't mean life's perfect, Mum. It just means I'm grateful." Victoria frowned. "Grateful? For what? Scrubbing floors?" "For another day to do it," Grace replied softly. There it was again, that quiet wisdom that didn't need applause. It disarmed her. She turned away before Grace could see the confusion in her eyes. Behind the facade of confidence, Victoria's thoughts began to unravel. That night she couldn't sleep. The mansion seemed too large, too empty. She wandered through it barefoot, her reflection following her in every mirror, an image she no longer recognized. She stopped in front of Ethan's door and listened. Music leaked faintly through the cracks, but his voice didn't. They barely spoke anymore. She thought about knocking, but didn't. Pride kept her hand frozen in mid-air. In the living room, the fireplace crackled faintly. She poured herself another drink and sat down, her mind drifting between memories and regrets. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered the question she'd been avoiding for years. What if all this wasn't enough? The question scared her more than loneliness. In the days that followed, the cracks began to widen. Ethan grew more distant. Charles's calls became less frequent. The charity invitations stopped feeling like accomplishments and started feeling like distractions. Yet Victoria continued to perform, to play her role in the theatre of perfection. One afternoon, she passed by Grace, humming softly while folding laundry in the service room. It was a hymn, one Victoria hadn't heard since childhood. She stopped listening for a moment before saying, "Where did you learn that song?" Grace looked up. "My mother used to sing it every morning. It helps me start the day with peace." Victoria swallowed hard. "My mother used to sing it too," she said, almost to herself. Then, after a pause, she added quickly, "Anyway, make sure those are ready before dinner." She walked away before the warmth in her chest could turn into something unfamiliar. Remorse. Sometimes transformation doesn't start with a revelation. It begins quietly in moments like these, when the walls we build begin to tremble from within. Victoria didn't realize it yet, but life was preparing to expose the hidden truth behind her illusion of control. Every unspoken prayer from Grace, every act of humility she dismissed, was slowly setting the stage for something far greater than either of them could imagine. And in just a few days, when tragedy struck without warning, all that she thought was secure would come undone, revealing the foundation beneath, the one built not on pride, but on grace she never believed she needed. It happened on a Thursday night. The kind of night that looked peaceful from the outside, city lights glowing softly, a warm breeze stirring the trees, the sound of crickets faint in the background, but inside Victoria's mansion, peace had no home. She sat at the dining table with an untouched meal in front of her, scrolling through emails she didn't care about. The silence was thick, her glass of wine half empty. She had texted Ethan an hour ago and received no reply. That wasn't unusual lately, but tonight something in her spirit felt off, an uneasiness she couldn't explain. When the phone finally rang, she snatched it up impatiently, assuming it was him. "Ethan, where have you been?" she snapped, but the voice on the other end wasn't her son's. It was low, professional, cold, the kind of voice that carries news no one wants to hear. "Mrs. Hayes, this is Officer Daniels with the Atlanta Police Department. There's been an accident." Her hand went numb. "An accident?" she repeated, her voice trembling for the first time in years. "What kind of accident?" "Your son, Ethan Hayes. He was involved in a collision on Route 84. He's being taken to St. Joseph's Hospital. You should come immediately." Time stopped. The sound of her own heartbeat thundered in her ears. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not possible. He was supposed to be home." But the words meant nothing. Within seconds, she was running out the door, keys in hand, the world spinning around her. The drive to the hospital was a blur. A rush of headlights, rain beginning to fall, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every second felt like punishment. When she burst through the emergency room doors, her voice cracked. "My son, Ethan Hayes, where is he?" The nurse looked up calmly. "Ma'am, please take a seat. The doctors are with him now." "I don't want to sit," she shouted, tears welling in her eyes. "Tell me if he's alive." The nurse lowered her gaze. "They're doing everything they can." Those words shattered something inside her. She stumbled backward into one of the chairs, her breathing ragged. The room smelled of antiseptic and fear. People passed by, strangers caught in their own storms, but for Victoria, the world had shrunk to a single, suffocating thought. What if I lose him? For the first time in her life, she felt powerless. All the control, all the influence, all the money, none of it mattered here. She couldn't buy her way out of this moment. She couldn't negotiate with fate. She could only wait. She called her husband. The call went straight to voicemail. She texted him again and again, but there was no response. She scrolled through her contacts. Names of people she had entertained, business partners, friends who had praised her. Success. She called a few, but none answered. One replied hours later with a polite message. "I'm so sorry to hear. Praying for you." But no one came. The seats beside her remained empty. As she sat there, trembling, she remembered something she hadn't thought about in years. Grace's voice, soft but sure, whispering prayers in the kitchen while wiping down counters. She had laughed then, rolled her eyes, called it superstition. But now, in the cold light of the hospital waiting room, that memory didn't seem so foolish. It seemed like hope. She folded her hands together without realizing it, fingers laced tightly, head bowed. It was awkward, unfamiliar, like a language she hadn't spoken in decades. "God, if you're real," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, please don't take my boy. I'll do anything." The tears came freely now, smudging her makeup. She didn't care. The pride that once held her upright dissolved into something raw, something human. She cried until her body shook, until all that was left was silence. Hours passed. The clock on the wall glowed 2:47 a.m. when the doctor finally approached, his face unreadable. "Mrs. Hayes?" She stood immediately. "Is he alive?" "He's in critical condition. We managed to stabilize him, but they're swelling in the brain. The next 24 hours will be crucial." Her legs nearly gave out. "Can I see him?" "Briefly," he said. "He's sedated." When she entered the room, she barely recognized her son. Tubes, wires, the faint beep of the monitor, the sound of life hanging by a thread. She took his hand, cold and fragile, and pressed it to her cheek. "Oh, Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mama's here. Please, please don't leave me like this." In that moment, everything she had ever valued fell away. The designer clothes, the parties, the social image. None of it could touch the reality of this sterile room. The truth was laid bare. She had spent years building a life so strong on the outside that she'd forgotten how fragile love could be on the inside. She stayed by his bedside for hours, unable to move. Nurses came and went, machines hummed, and she just sat there, whispering words she didn't even believe she remembered. "Please, God, please." Morning crept in slowly, painting the room in pale light. Her phone buzzed again. More polite messages, more empty words. No one came, not even Charles. She was utterly alone. And then, through the fog of exhaustion and despair, she thought of Grace. Again, that image. Grace, kneeling by her bed, hands clasped, praying not for herself, but for others. She had mocked that faith, called it naive. But now, it was the only thing she wanted to borrow. She didn't know how or why, but she reached for her phone and typed a message with trembling hands. "Grace, it's Mrs. Hayes. Ethan is in the hospital. Please, please pray for him." For a long time, there was no reply. Victoria set the phone down and leaned her head against the bedrail. Her tears had dried, but her heart still ached in a way she had never known before. She watched her son's chest rise and fall and whispered, "I should have been there more, shouldn't I?" She didn't expect an answer. But in that room filled with machines and quiet prayers, something in her spirit shifted, a crack forming in the armor she'd worn her entire life. Minutes later, her phone vibrated. One simple message lit up the screen. "I'm already praying, ma'am. You're not alone." She stared at those words for a long time, unable to explain why they brought her such comfort. She closed her eyes, whispering, "Not alone." And for the first time in years, she meant it. The hospital staff moved around her with quiet efficiency. She didn't notice. Her entire world had narrowed to the rhythm of Ethan's heart monitor, a fragile beat that mirrored her own. She realized something then, something she had spent her life avoiding. She couldn't control everything. She couldn't fix everything. And maybe that was the point. Outside, the rain had stopped. The city was beginning to wake. Somewhere across town, Grace was kneeling beside her bed, her own Bible open, whispering Ethan's name in prayer. And though Victoria didn't know it yet, that prayer, spoken in faith by the woman she once despised, was already beginning to move something unseen, setting in motion a transformation neither of them could have imagined. Hours later, the doctor returned with cautious optimism. "He's holding steady," he said. "That's a good sign." Victoria nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere, on Grace, on the quiet strength she had mocked, on the faith she had long abandoned. She looked at her son's face and whispered, "I believe. I'm trying to believe." And as she sat there in that small, sterile room, stripped of pride and surrounded by silence, the first flicker of grace found its way into her heart. The road ahead would be long, full of revelations, and the painful unlearning of everything she thought she knew about. Love, strength, and control. But the transformation had already begun, quietly, humbly, in the same way faith always begins, when there's nothing left to hold on to but hope itself. The text from Grace arrived just after sunrise, a simple line that carried more weight than any speech. "I'm already praying, ma'am. You're not alone." Victoria stared at the words, as if they were a doorway she wasn't sure she was allowed to walk through. The waiting room hummed with the low soundtrack of exhaustion, coffee cups clinking, shoes shuffling, the constant murmur of machines somewhere behind closed doors. She rubbed her temples and tried to slow her breathing. For years she'd relied on composure as armor, but now every breath felt like a confession. In that vulnerable silence, the automatic doors slid open and Grace stepped inside, clutching her worn purse, rain still beading on her coat. She didn't hesitate. She didn't glance around for permission. She saw Victoria, and in that instant all the rules that usually separated them seemed irrelevant, almost laughable, like a costume taken off after a long, dishonest performance. "Grace," Victoria said, and the sound of her own voice startled her. It was small, unguarded. "I didn't know if you would." She stopped. Pride had no vocabulary for this moment. Grace took her hand, warm and steady. "I'm here," she said. "I came as soon as I heard." There was no judgment in her tone, no trace of the humiliations that had stacked up between them like bricks. She didn't need them. The hidden truth in suffering is that it scrapes away everything unnecessary until only the essential remains, and what remained in Grace was compassion. She asked no questions. She simply followed Victoria down the long corridor toward Ethan's room, walking with a quiet purpose that made time feel different, slower, gentler, as if the hallway itself were a bridge they had to cross together. Inside the room, the light was soft and clinical. The steady beeping of the monitor mapped a rhythm that felt too fragile to trust. Ethan lay motionless, bandaged, tubes and wires forming a net that tethered him to the present. Victoria's eyes filled again. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "I would give anything, anything to fix this." Grace moved to the far side of the bed and placed a hand near Ethan's arm, careful not to disturb a single wire. "You're his mother," she said softly. "You're already doing everything right by being here." Then she turned, and her gaze met Victoria's. "May I pray with you?" Victoria didn't answer with words. She nodded, a single, trembling motion, like a woman giving consent to an operation she feared but needed. Grace took both her hands, and rather than bowing her head immediately, she looked first into Victoria's eyes, searching for fear's center. She found it, and squeezed gently. "We'll carry this together." Grace closed her eyes and began, her voice low and a little unsteady, but full of an authority that had nothing to do with status. "Father," she paused, and the pause itself felt holy. "We come to you with nothing but our need. You see Ethan. You know every breath he takes, every cell in his body, every fear in his mother's heart. We ask for your mercy. We ask for healing. We ask for the kind of peace that doesn't make sense to the world, but makes sense to you. If there's anything in us that needs softening, soften it. If there's pride that needs to break, so your love can come through, break it gently, Lord." Her voice trembled, then steadied. "You are the God who stays in rooms like this." Victoria's fingers tightened in Grace's. She found herself whispering, not to interrupt, but to add the small truth she could finally say out loud. "I've been wrong," she said, breath catching. "I've been so wrong about everything." The confession surprised her. It felt like a decision, a recalibration of mindset she hadn't planned but needed. She pressed on through the lump in her throat. "Please, help my boy. I can't lose him." Grace nodded as if to say, "I heard you," and so did he. "Lord, you know this mother," she continued. "You know the journey she's walked, the walls she built, the reasons she thought she had to be stronger than her own heart. Give her courage, the kind that looks like surrender, and hold this child. Hold him like only you can." The prayer changed the atmosphere. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden chorus of angels, no bursting light. But the room felt warmer, as though the white walls had absorbed the sound and were humming it back. That's the behind-the-scenes work of faith. Quiet, steady pressure that reshapes what it touches. Even the monitor's beep seemed less clinical and more like a metronome, keeping time with their courage. Victoria wiped her face with the sleeve of her jacket, not caring about the mascara streaks. She leaned over the bed and whispered to her son, "Baby, it's Mom. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Grace stayed where she was and let silence do part of the work. Then she prayed again, not with new words, but with a softer intensity, the kind that rises from the center of a person who's tried anger and found it empty, who's tried control and found it heavy, who's tried cynicism and found it boring. Jesus, be close, she said, and the simplicity of it felt like truth. Be close. A nurse stepped in to check the IV. She glanced at the two women, their hands clasped, and offered a small, respectful nod. He's holding steady, she said, and jotted notes on the chart. When she left, the door clicked shut with a tenderness that made Victoria exhale for the first time in hours. What if he doesn't wake up? Victoria asked, her voice barely above air. What if I'm too late to make anything right? Grace answered without rushing. Then you love him right now, exactly how he needs it, and you let God hold what you can't. She paused and added, but I'm asking him to wake your boy. I'm asking him to give you time. Victoria looked at her, baffled by the certainty. How can you be so sure? I'm not, Grace admitted. I'm just not alone. She touched her Bible, tucked into her purse, the edges wrinkled like the hands of an old friend. That's the difference. Faith doesn't make guarantees. It gives you someone to hold while you wait. The words settled into Victoria's chest like medicine. She had spent years medicating with image and achievement. Now she felt the strange, clean ache of choosing something else. It was a different kind of decision, the sort that doesn't announce itself with speeches, but with posture. She straightened a little and interlaced her fingers with Ethan's. I hear you, she whispered to Grace, and to the ceiling, and to the farthest corners of herself. I hear you. They prayed again. Grace's voice was steadier now, threaded with a strength that rises from love rather than leverage. God, would you touch his mind, his brain, the swelling, the trauma? Would you guide every hand that cares for him? She said, enunciating each word like a careful step across a fragile bridge. And would you show this mother that grace isn't something we earn, it's something we receive? She took a breath. I need it too. The admission surprised Victoria. You? She asked. You always seem so together. Grace smiled with one side of her mouth. I'm not special, she said gently. I'm just held. Then, more quietly, I don't pray because I'm strong. I pray because I'm not. There it was, the revelation that moved the ground under Victoria's feet. She had mocked prayer as childish hope because she had never learned how to be small without feeling worthless. But smallness in this room didn't feel like humiliation. It felt like space opening up for something honest. She looked at her son, at the pale rise and fall of his chest, and let the space expand. God, she said, still testing the shape of the word, I haven't spoken to you in years, but if you can hear me, I'm listening. I don't know how to do this without you. Grace's hands squeezed hers again, an unspoken liturgy of solidarity. The monitor kept its time, and in that steady rhythm, Victoria felt a new one begin inside her, something like alignment, mindset changing, pride loosening, a willingness to be led. The decisions she'd built her life on, control, image, deflection, suddenly looked like props abandoned after a disappointing show. She could feel the impact of letting them fall, the strange relief of unclenching. The door opened and a resident entered, speaking gently about scans and timelines, about swelling that might respond, about possibilities that existed just beyond the reach of certainty. He addressed them both, as if Grace belonged there as much as the mother did, and asked if they had questions. Victoria realized she had many, none of which were medical. She asked a few anyway, and when the door closed again, she turned to Grace, eyes damp but clearer. Would you keep praying? She asked, and the humility in the request felt like walking barefoot on fresh ground. I will, Grace said, but I want you to try too. I don't know the words, Victoria confessed. Tell him the truth, Grace replied. That's all prayer is. So Victoria did. Not eloquently, not beautifully, just truth in small sentences. I'm scared, she breathed. I'm sorry. I want my son. I want to be different. It was the beginning of a journey she didn't plan, a behind-the-scenes transformation that would not show up on any scan, but would alter everything visible. Hours turned like slow pages. They sat together, sometimes speaking, sometimes silent, sometimes praying out loud, sometimes just holding Ethan's hand, while thoughts formed without language. The hospital, usually brutal in its indifference, felt softer around the edges, no less serious, but more human. Nurses came and went with faces that looked like mercy. Grace stepped out twice to call Lila and once to bring back coffee. She returned each time with the same steady expression, as if she were guarding a flame in bad weather. Victoria studied her. "How do you keep this peace?" she asked in a lull, as if she were inquiring about a recipe. Grace considered. "It's not mine," she said at last. "It's borrowed. I ask for it every day." "From God," Victoria said, not as a question, but as a realization. "From God," Grace affirmed, "and from people who remind me who He is when I forget. We don't do this alone." The words loosened another knot inside Victoria. She had built a brand of strength that isolated her from help. Now, in the presence of a maid she had treated like furniture, she could finally admit what she wanted. "I don't want to be alone," she said, and the confession was both childlike and courageous. "You're not," Grace said, motioning toward Ethan, toward heaven, toward the quiet circle the three of them had formed. "Not here." The afternoon light shifted. A chaplain paused at the doorway, and seeing the scene, nodded silently and moved on. A janitor pushed a mop past the threshold and backed away without crossing the invisible line. Something sacred had marked the space, and even those who didn't share its language respected its borders. As the sun began to lower, the doctor returned with a measured update. "No worse, a little hope in the numbers. Keep waiting, keep steady." He left, and the two women exhaled in unison, a duo learning the same rhythm. Grace bowed her head once more. "Thank you for every small mercy," she whispered. "Thank you for every breath." Victoria brushed hair from Ethan's forehead and rested her head briefly against the bedrail, thinking about the journey that had brought her here, how the decisions she'd worshipped had led to loneliness, how the revelations of the last hours had landed like unexpected kindness. "If you're listening," she murmured, "I'm choosing different now." She didn't promise perfection. She didn't bargain. She simply chose. And in that choosing felt the first steady step of a transformation that would not be choreographed or announced, only lived. Evening gathered itself outside. The hospital lights glowed against the fading sky, and somewhere down the hall, a lullaby melody chimed from a distant NICU, a reminder that life begins and struggles at the same address. Grace stood and stretched her back, then placed her hand lightly on Victoria's shoulder. "I'm going to call Lila again and let her know I'll be here a while longer," she said. "Do you want anything?" "Just keep praying," Victoria replied, and the words no longer sounded like a stranger's. "I will," Grace said, stepping toward the door. She hesitated and turned back. "You can keep going too." Victoria nodded and bowed her head, her lips moving without sound. The room settled into a quiet expectancy, the kind that fills a space just before something shifts. The monitor kept its faithful cadence, and in the faint glow of evening, a nurse noted a small change on the chart, subtle, cautious, but real enough to circle in pencil. And while no one declared victory, both women felt the air change, as if the door to a long-locked room had finally opened a few inches, just enough to let breath in. The days that followed learned a new rhythm, measured, careful, stitched together by beeps, footsteps, and whispered prayers. Morning bled into night without fanfare, and yet each hour felt like a small decision. Wait, hope, breathe. The doctors spoke in guarded phrases, reducing sedation, watching the scans, monitoring swelling, as if language itself might tip the balance. Victoria stayed in the narrow chair by Ethan's bed until her body ached, and when Grace told her to rest, she would press her forehead to the rail and murmur, "I'm not leaving him," as much to herself as to anyone listening. Nurses began to greet them the way people greet regulars at an all-night diner, with a kindness born from repetition. One brought tea the way Grace liked it. Another left a blanket folded on the windowsill for Victoria, pretending not to notice when she used it to wipe fresh tears. The hospital had become a world inside a world, a behind-the-scenes stage where the usual rules, status, image, performance, meant nothing. In that timeless space, surrender began to take its shape. It didn't arrive like a lightning bolt. It crept in through small choices. "Lord, I can't fix this," Victoria whispered whenever anxiety clenched her chest. "Help me trust." "You for the next 10 minutes." Grace would nod, as if the prayer needed a witness to stand firm, and answer quietly, "10 minutes at a time is still faith." Sometimes they prayed aloud. Sometimes they sat with hands clasped and let hope do the talking. And sometimes Victoria would find herself speaking without planning to, tasting humility for the first time and realizing it wasn't bitter at all. "I was so sure I could carry everything," she confessed once, her voice a thin thread in the dim light. "I didn't even notice I'd dropped the things that mattered." Grace's reply was gentle and matter-of-fact. "You notice now? That's a mercy." On the fourth morning, the air felt different. No science could measure it, but even the fluorescent light seemed less harsh. The resident who checked the monitor smiled before he could stop himself. "Numbers look better," he said, and the way he emphasized the last word sounded like permission to breathe. They dared to. Victoria squeezed Ethan's fingers, then startled. Had his hand twitched, or had she imagined it? She looked to Grace, who had noticed the same flicker. "Did you see that?" Victoria asked, and for the first time her fear made room for wonder. "I did," Grace answered, a careful joy rising. "Let's thank God for one movement." Hours stretched like soft taffy. A chaplain stopped by and left a small card with a psalm on it, and Victoria kept turning it over in her hand as if it were a key. She wasn't ready to read it aloud, but she liked the weight of it in her pocket, like a promise she didn't have to perform. Around noon, the physician in charge entered with a measured tone that couldn't hide its brightness. "We're going to gently reduce sedation and see how he responds," she said. "We'll move slowly." Victoria nodded, eyes fixed on Ethan's face, memorizing the shape of his eyelashes, the way his hair curled near the bandage. She had spent years noticing imperfections in linen and centerpieces. Now she noticed the holiness of breath. The process took time. The room felt like a chapel, no stained glass, just steady attention, the kind that makes silence feel full. Then, as if some hidden dialogue between body and spirit reached agreement, the first sign arrived. Ethan's eyelids fluttered, a small, almost imperceptible shift in the muscles of his face. Victoria leaned forward so fast her chair scraped. "Ethan," she whispered, the name a prayer and a plea. "It's Mom. I'm here." The nurse raised a hand to slow her, and Grace placed her palm on Victoria's shoulder, anchoring her in patience. "Give him a moment," Grace murmured. "Let him find the surface." Another breath, another flutter. This time his fingers moved, just enough for Victoria to feel a faint squeeze. She inhaled sharply. "Baby, can you hear me?" The resident's face changed from neutrality to relief. "That's a good sign," he said, smiling without caution now. "Very good." His eyes opened in fragments, unfocused at first, then gathering. Clarity like dawn gathering light. He looked around confused, as if surfacing from a deep, cold lake. Then he found her. "Mom!" His voice cracked. A fragile reed, but it was his. Victoria's whole body answered before her mouth could. She laughed and cried at the same time, pressing his hand to her cheek. "I'm here. I'm here." He closed his eyes again, not in retreat, but in rest, and the team began their careful checks, pupil response, reflexes, the long list of tests that convert miracles into measurements. The doctor spoke the phrase she'd practiced for families like this, unexpected recovery. On the chart, she circled numbers and noted improvements and said things like encouraging trajectory. Victoria heard the words and understood them. But she felt something else, something that didn't fit into the columns of the electronic record. "It's a miracle," she said, not loudly, not to argue with medicine, but because she had discovered a vocabulary that could hold both science and grace. "It's a miracle," she repeated, and each repetition settled into her bones like a new alignment. Grace's cheeks shone with tears that made no noise. She turned her face slightly, trying to hide the sob that escaped, and then stopped hiding. "Thank you," she whispered into the air, into the mystery, into the presence that had somehow made this sterile room feel like home. The doctor glanced at them with a soft respect, as if acknowledging a language beyond her jurisdiction. "He'll need time," she cautioned. "We're not out of the woods, but this is very encouraging." Victoria nodded, still holding Ethan's hand as if she were holding onto a rope that had lowered itself into the darkest pit and found purchase. The afternoon unfolded in slow circles. Ethan slept, woke, slept again. He answered simple questions, squeezed fingers on command, tracked a pen with his eyes. Each small success felt like an answered letter arriving after years of silence. When he drifted off, again, Victoria turned to Grace and finally saw her fully without the old lenses of status and defense. "You stayed," she said, wonder woven through the words. "You stayed through all of it." "I wasn't going to leave you," Grace replied, and the sentence carried no triumph, just truth. "God didn't leave me when I was a mess. I'm just passing that along." Victoria covered her mouth and nodded, a new kind of cry forming, not the cry of loss, but the cry that comes when gratitude is too large for the throat. "I don't know how to say thank you," she said. "Not to you, not to him. I don't know the right way." Grace smiled. "There isn't one," she answered. "You live it. That's the way." Then, after a breath, she added, "One decision at a time." That was the word that kept returning. Decisions. Not the grand, strategic ones that used to fill Victoria's calendar, but the quiet kind that transform a person's mindset from the inside out. She could feel them lining up in front of her like stepping stones across a river she had long refused to cross. Apologize, listen, repair, forgive, trust. One by one, not as a performance, but as a journey. The hidden truth of surrender was revealing itself. Real power was not the freedom to control everything. It was the courage to release what you were never meant to hold. When Ethan woke again and asked for water, Victoria helped him sip from a straw with the clumsy tenderness of a first-time mother. "You scared me," she said lightly, trying to keep the weight out of her tone for his sake. He managed a faint smile. "Sorry, Mom." The familiar teenage sarcasm in those two words fell like music. She brushed his hair back, and he shut his eyes, trusting her touch. The impact of that trust landed with a kind of gentle force. She hadn't earned it lately. She would now. Word of his improvement traveled through the ward, the way good news always does. Quietly, efficiently, with the relief that gives strangers permission to smile. A nurse who had never spoken more than 2 sentences to Victoria paused at the door and said, "We've been rooting for him." Then she turned to Grace and added, almost conspiratorially, "We've been rooting for you too." Grace laughed, surprised. "Me?" The nurse nodded. "You're kind. That's rare in here." After she left, Victoria looked at Grace with new eyes. "You change rooms," she said. "You walk in, and the air changes." Grace shook her head. "It's not me," she answered. "It's who walks in with me." As evening gathered at the windows, Charles finally arrived, creased suit, cologne sharp, eyes darting between apology and discomfort. "I got here as fast as I could," he said, standing like a visitor in his own life. He put a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and then, for the first time in a long time, allowed emotion to pull at his features. "Hey, champ!" Ethan blinked, too tired to pass the tension, and drifted back to sleep. The awkwardness made the room feel narrow. Victoria felt defensive reflexes. Rise, old habits eager to reclaim their territory, but she pushed them back with effort she could feel in her muscles. "He woke up," she told Charles, choosing facts over accusations. "The doctors are hopeful." Charles exhaled, relief softening him. "I'm grateful," he said, and it was the first time she heard that word from him without a price tag attached. When he stepped into the hall to make calls, Victoria turned to Grace again. "I want to be different," she said quietly, the way a person speaks to someone they trust, not to mock them. "Not just because of today, because I finally see the cost of who I've been." Grace didn't hurry to fill the silence. She let the confession occupy the room, giving it the dignity of space. "Then start," she said after a while. Start when you walk out of here, and start again tomorrow when you wake up. The miracle isn't that everything changed in one moment. It's that you can keep choosing to change in 1,000 small ones. That night, when the monitors hummed their lullaby and the city settled into its own uneasy sleep, Victoria stood by the window and watched the reflection of the room overlay the dark glass. She could see herself, Grace seated nearby, Ethan breathing steadily. The overlay looked like a metaphor, past and present, sharing the same space. I used to think small meant weak, she admitted, not turning around. Now it feels like the only way to tell the truth. Grace's answer drifted across the room, warm and steady. Small's where God builds big things. Morning brought more tests and guarded smiles. The phrase unexpected recovery kept reappearing like a refrain, but to Victoria it had already been translated into a word she would defend, even when no one else used it. Gift. She began to thank the staff by name, to look them in the eye and ask about their families, to fold the blanket that had become her undignified handkerchief and leave it neatly by the window. She asked Grace about Lila, about their apartment, about the bus routes and grocery prices she had never understood. Every answer felt like geography she had refused to learn because she didn't think she'd ever need to visit. Now she wanted to live there for a while. In the quiet intervals, she prayed in sentences that still surprised her. "Help me be the kind of mother he needs," she said softly. "Help me be the kind of woman I should have been. Help me do the work that comes after gratitude." The work, she knew now, would include apologies that cost something, generosity without an audience, decisions made for the right reasons when no one was watching. It wasn't penance, it was alignment, a mindset that finally matched the truth she had been shown. Ethan's voice grew stronger, bit by bit. By the second afternoon he could string together questions, and the first one made Victoria smile and swallow a lump at the same time. "Did I miss my chemistry test?" She laughed. "You're grounded for worrying about that." He tried to roll his eyes and winced. "Kidding," she said and kissed his temple. "We'll talk about tests later." Later. The word felt like sunrise. There was a moment, small, unscripted, when Victoria looked up and caught Grace crying again, this time quiet and unguarded, a hand over her mouth as if to keep the gratitude from spilling too loudly into the room. "Why are you crying?" Victoria asked, stepping closer. Grace shook her head, smiling through it. "Because I asked God to hold him," she said, "and I can see that he is." Then she added, almost as a confession, "and because I'm relieved to finally cry in joy instead of asking for strength." The sentence landed like a benediction. By evening, the doctor spoke the most human sentence of the week. "He's hungry." They laughed, tears making everything shimmer. A few spoonfuls of broth later, Ethan fell back asleep, and the room exhaled with him. Victoria leaned back, exhaustion settling into her bones in a way that felt honest rather than dangerous. She looked at Grace and whispered, "For the first time, I feel small in the right way." Grace nodded, recognizing the holy shrinking that makes room for love. What waited beyond this room would ask for courage, conversations at the mansion that would not be pretty, decisions about apologies and fairness, repairs to bridges she had burned on purpose and by accident. The journey would move from hospital corridors to living rooms and kitchens, from promises to practices. But as the lights dimmed and the monitors kept their faithful count, Victoria could already feel the next step gathering like a tide. She reached for Grace's hand once more, the grip now familiar, and let a quiet sentence anchor what came next. "When we go home," she said, steady and sure, "I'm ready to begin." When Victoria and Ethan finally returned home, the mansion looked unchanged. Same marble floors, same gleaming chandeliers, same stillness that used to feel like control. But now it felt like absence. The air itself seemed heavier, as if the walls were holding their breath. Nothing had moved, yet everything inside her had. She stood in the doorway for a long time, taking it in, the polished staircase, the paintings that once impressed guests but never moved her, the table that had hosted dinners full of noise but no warmth. For years, she had believed her house reflected her worth. Now, it only mirrored her emptiness. Grace followed them inside, carrying Ethan's small overnight bag. He was walking. On his own now, slow but steady, his skin still pale but his spirit brighter. "Home sweet home," he whispered, half smiling. Victoria tried to return it, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time, she noticed how hollow the phrase sounded when love wasn't present to fill it. Ethan headed upstairs to rest, and Victoria found herself alone with Grace in the vast, echoing kitchen. The silence was uncomfortable at first. Too many memories lived in that space. Every counter, every polished appliance had witnessed moments of arrogance she couldn't erase. She turned to Grace, the weight of years pressing down on her, and said softly, "I've been rehearsing this in my head for days." Grace looked up, eyes gentle but steady. "You don't need to rehearse truth, Mom. Just say it." Victoria took a deep breath, her voice trembling in a way it never had before. "I'm sorry. For all of it. For every cruel word, every look, every time I made you feel small." Tears rose before she could stop them. "You were right here in front of me, living the faith I mocked, and I was too blind to see it. You prayed for my son when I didn't even know how to pray for myself." Grace set the bag down and took a step closer. "I forgive you," she said simply, and the sincerity in her tone hit harder than any sermon. "God doesn't change people through power," she added. "He changes us through love." Victoria's lips parted in surprise. The sentence felt like a key turning somewhere deep inside. Her chest. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs and buried her face in her hands. For years, she had believed love was something earned, bargained for, or proven through achievement. She had controlled affection the same way she controlled everything else. But here was Grace, standing before her, humble, calm, and free, offering forgiveness without demand. "I don't deserve that," Victoria whispered. Grace smiled faintly. "That's why it's called grace." The irony wasn't lost on her. Grace, the woman she had ridiculed, now embodied the very mercy her soul craved. For the first time, the name itself felt like a message. Victoria stood and walked to the window, watching the afternoon light spill across the lawn. Everything looked the same, yet she was seeing it differently. The world hadn't changed, but her lens had. That's the hidden truth about transformation. It's not about new surroundings, it's about new sight. The next few days unfolded quietly, but the silence was no longer empty. It was healing. Victoria moved through her routines with new intention. She brewed her own coffee instead of demanding it. She greeted the gardeners by name. She started writing small thank-you notes to hospital staff, folding them neatly and mailing them one by one. These gestures weren't grand or dramatic, but they were steps, tiny acts of repentance that stitched humility into her days. Ethan recovered faster than anyone expected, though he carried faint scars and a new gravity in his eyes. One evening he found his mother sitting in the living room with her Bible open, a sight that startled him. "You're reading that?" he asked with a half-smile. Victoria looked up. "Trying to," she admitted. "It's not easy. Some verses feel like mirrors." He nodded, sitting beside her. "I guess that's the point." Her laugh was soft, the kind that carried both pain and relief. "I used to think faith was for people who couldn't handle life. But it turns out I was the one hiding behind everything. Money could buy because I couldn't handle what I'd become." She turned the page and stopped at a verse Grace had mentioned days earlier. "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." The words struck her differently now. She'd been overcome for years by pride, by fear, by her obsession with control. Overcoming, she realized, wasn't about triumph. It was about surrender. Later that week, Grace invited her to attend Sunday service at a small church downtown. The invitation hung in the air for a moment before Victoria answered. "Do you really think I'd fit in there?" she asked, half embarrassed, half curious. Grace's response was simple. "Church isn't about fitting in, it's about showing up." So she did. That Sunday, Victoria dressed not in her usual tailored perfection, but in a plain navy dress she hadn't worn in years. She didn't wear jewelry, didn't style her hair to perfection. Grace and her daughter Lila met her outside. The church was small, white siding, wooden steps, and a steeple that had weathered decades of southern storms. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood polish and hymn books. There were no chandeliers, no marble floors, just creaking pews, and the sound of quiet chatter that felt oddly comforting. When the music began, Victoria stood uncertainly beside Grace. The congregation sang a hymn she vaguely remembered from childhood, something about surrender and mercy. She tried to sing but couldn't at first. Her throat tightened. Then Lila's voice lifted, softly beside her, clear and full of belief, and Victoria found herself joining in, shaky but sincere. For the first time in her adult life, she felt small in the best possible way. It wasn't humiliation, it was release. Every note of that song peeled back a layer of armor. Every lyric was a revelation she didn't know she needed. When the pastor spoke about forgiveness being a kind of freedom, Victoria felt the truth of it pulse through her chest. After the service, she stayed seated for a long time while others chatted and laughed around her. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder and said quietly, "You don't have to rush. Let it sink in." Victoria nodded, wiping her eyes. "It feels strange," she said. "I spent years chasing the idea of freedom, career, status, control, and I never realized I was the one building my own cage." Grace smiled. "Freedom doesn't come from climbing higher. It comes from letting go." On the drive home, Victoria watched the sunlight flicker through the trees. Each flash like a heartbeat, reminding her that life was still unfolding, still generous enough to give her another chance. The world outside the car looked ordinary, but she felt as if she were seeing creation for the first time. Even the imperfections, the cracks in the sidewalk, the chipped paint on the guardrail, looked strangely beautiful. Maybe that was the point. Grace makes room for imperfection, and in doing so, it makes space for love. Back at the mansion, she invited Grace and Lila to stay for dinner. The idea startled even her. The table that once symbolized hierarchy now became a place of connection. She set 3 plates instead of 2, and when the food was ready, she gestured for them to sit. "Not to serve," she said with a smile, "but to eat with me." Grace hesitated, then sat down slowly. "You sure?" "Absolutely," Victoria said, taking a deep breath. "This house has been empty long enough. It's time it feels like home." They prayed together before the meal, Grace leading, Lila adding a small "Amen" at the end, and Victoria whispering the same word like it was her first time speaking it honestly. As they ate, laughter began to fill the spaces that used to echo with command. For the first time, Victoria listened, not to respond, not to assert, but to understand. Later that evening, when Grace and Lila left, Victoria stood by the doorway and watched them drive away. She felt something stirring deep inside, a quiet conviction that this was just the beginning. Her repentance wasn't a single apology. It was a lifestyle, a mindset shift that would take daily practice. The transformation she had mocked in others was now hers to nurture. She walked through the house once more, but this time she didn't see marble or grandeur. She saw opportunity, rooms that could hold kindness, walls that could echo with laughter, and a life no longer built on fear. When she reached Ethan's door, she paused. He was asleep, his breathing even, his face peaceful. She leaned against the doorframe and whispered, "Thank you," her voice barely audible but heavy with meaning. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular, maybe at Grace, maybe at God, maybe at both. It didn't matter. Gratitude had finally found its voice. As she walked downstairs, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, the reflection of the cross necklace Grace had once worn, forgotten on the counter near the sink. She picked it up gently, holding it between her fingers. The metal was worn smooth, the chain delicate. For a moment she pressed it to her heart, and the quiet that followed wasn't emptiness, it was peace. Outside, the night was clear. The same stars she used to overlook now glimmered like promises, each one a reminder that light has a way of returning, even after the longest darkness. Victoria exhaled slowly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Change, she realized, didn't happen in one dramatic sweep. It unfolded one surrendered moment at a time. And as she turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, she carried that truth with her. The knowledge that faith wasn't something she had to understand to feel. It was something she could finally live. Sometimes change doesn't announce itself. It just arrives quietly, one small decision at a time, until the life you used to know no longer fits. For Victoria Hayes, the woman who once measured worth in money and power, transformation didn't come in thunder or fire. It came in whispers, in a prayer she didn't expect to say, in a kindness she didn't think she could offer, in the stillness of a morning where gratitude felt like oxygen. The mansion hadn't changed much from the outside, but the woman who lived inside it had. What used to echo with control now resonated with calm. Each morning began differently now. She no longer woke to the sound of alarms or meetings waiting on her approval. Instead, she poured coffee herself, opened the curtains, and let the sunlight spill across the floor. There was something about those first few minutes of quiet that reminded her that life wasn't a performance. It was a gift. The power dynamics that once defined her world had been replaced by something far greater: humility. Grace still came by often, though their relationship no longer resembled employer and employee. It was something gentler, more genuine. They cooked together sometimes, shared stories, even laughed about the old days. Victoria had offered her a permanent position overseeing community outreach for a new charity foundation she was building, one that focused on helping struggling families pay medical bills. "I want to use what I have differently," she told Grace, "not to impress people, but to serve them." Grace had smiled, her eyes glimmering. "That's what blessings are for, Mum, using them to bless others." Victoria had laughed softly. "I told you to stop calling me Mum." "I'll try," Grace said, with that same calm humor that could turn even heavy moments light. There was a peace between them now, the kind that grows only after forgiveness has taken root. But beneath that peace lived something deeper, a shared understanding that life's most powerful lessons rarely come through comfort. They come through surrender. On Sundays, the three of them, Victoria, Grace, and Lila, would drive together to the small church downtown. At first, Victoria felt like an outsider stepping into another world. The music was raw and heartfelt, not polished or professional. The pastor didn't stand behind a crystal lectern. He spoke from the floor, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright with conviction. Yet everything about that place felt real in a way she hadn't felt in years. During one service, he spoke words that settled deep into her heart. "Sometimes," he said, "God uses the humble to reach the hardened. Pride blinds the eyes, but grace opens the heart." Victoria closed her eyes and let the sentence sink in. It felt like a mirror, one that reflected both who she had been and who she was becoming. For so long, she'd worn her pride like armor, convincing herself it was strength. Now she saw it for what it truly was, a barrier between her and everything meaningful. That day, after the service ended, she didn't rush to leave. She stayed, shaking hands with people she didn't know, listening to stories that had nothing to do with status or wealth. A single mother shared how Grace's volunteer team had helped her pay rent after she lost her job. A retired teacher talked about how the community garden had become her reason to wake up each morning. And then, in the middle of all those conversations, Victoria realized that humility wasn't a loss of power. It was the beginning of connection. Back at home, she started letting go of things she'd once guarded like treasure. Designer gowns, expensive decor, art that symbolized nothing but excess. All sold or donated. She replaced them with warmth. A photo of Ethan smiling again, a Bible open on her nightstand, a small, handwritten note from Grace that read, "You are seen, you are forgiven, you are loved." Her days filled with quiet acts of service. She began volunteering at the local food bank, sorting cans beside people she would have once walked past without a glance. At first, others didn't recognize her. The former socialite whose name had once been synonymous with luxury, but recognition wasn't what she sought. The real transformation happened in the moments no one saw, like when she knelt to tie a child's shoe at a donation drive, or when she stayed late to mop the floor after everyone left. Those moments became her new definition of worth. One afternoon, she visited Grace's neighborhood for the first time, the one she used to imagine as dangerous or depressing. But as she walked its streets, she saw laughter echoing between houses, children playing barefoot, neighbors helping one another fix fences and share meals. There was life here, real and unpolished, but filled with something her old world had lacked: community. She stopped by Grace's apartment, where Lila was doing homework at the kitchen table. Grace poured tea as Victoria looked around, noticing the framed Bible verse on the wall. "Blessed are the humble, for they will be exalted." It was written in simple handwriting, nothing ornate, but it carried more power than any quote she'd ever engraved on marble. "This place feels alive," Victoria said quietly. "Not because of what's in it, but because of who's in it." Grace smiled. "It's not the walls that make a home. It's the love that fills it." Those words lingered with her long after she drove away. The hidden truth of her journey became clearer with each passing day. Humility wasn't about losing what she had. It was about gaining what she'd been missing: peace, purpose, connection. Even Ethan began to notice the change. He'd watch his mother humming while cooking, something she hadn't done since he was a little boy. "You seem different, Mom," he said one evening, as they set the table together. "I am," she admitted. "It's strange, but I think for the first time in my life I actually like who I'm becoming." He grinned. "You mean you're not going to yell at me for putting the fork on the wrong side?" She laughed, shaking her head. "Not tonight." Grace joined them for dinner that night too. The conversation flowed naturally. Stories, jokes, even quiet moments that didn't need filling. When the meal ended, Victoria looked at Grace across the table and said, "You? No, I used to think you worked for me, but the truth is you were sent to me." Grace's eyes glistened. "God has a way of putting people where they're needed," she said, "even if we don't see it right away." The months passed, and the community foundation began to grow. Victoria attended meetings, not as the powerful benefactor she once was, but as a student of compassion. She asked questions, listened more than she spoke, and treated every decision like a chance to do something good. Her old friends didn't understand the change. Some drifted away, others mocked it, but she no longer needed their approval. She'd found something stronger than reputation: redemption. One morning, as she stood before the mirror tying her hair back, she caught her reflection and barely recognized herself, not because her face had changed, but because her eyes finally looked alive. The lines of worry had softened, replaced by peace. "Thank you," she whispered, and though the words were quiet, they carried the full weight of her journey. She visited the church again that Sunday, this time not as a guest, but as part of its story. Grace was there, sitting beside her as always. The pastor spoke about renewal, the kind that comes when we stop running from who we are and let love rebuild us piece by piece. Victoria looked around at the congregation, people from every background, united not by perfection, but by hope. She thought about her old life, about the mansion that had once been her castle of pride, and she smiled softly. Grace leaned toward her and said, "You look peaceful." "I am," Victoria replied. "It's strange, isn't it? You spend your whole life chasing control, only to find freedom in letting go." Grace nodded. "That's the paradox of faith. The smaller you become, the bigger your heart gets." The music began again, and the congregation rose to sing. Victoria closed her eyes, letting the sound fill her chest. There were no more walls between who she had been and who she was. Now, just the quiet certainty that Grace had found her, and she had finally stopped running from it. The camera would have captured her then, hands lifted slightly, eyes closed, tears glinting under the morning light, as the voiceover whispered the lesson her life had come to embody. Sometimes God uses the humble to reach the hardened. Pride blinds the eyes, but grace opens the heart. Outside, the church doors swung open and sunlight poured in. The world was still the same, imperfect, loud, unpredictable, but inside Victoria everything was different. Her journey had taught her that faith isn't about escaping pain, it's about finding purpose through it. And as she stepped into that light with Grace beside her, she knew the story wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. The sanctuary was almost empty when the last notes of the hymn faded into silence. The evening light filtered through the old stained glass, scattering gold and crimson across the worn wooden pews. Grace lingered. Near the front, her small frame illuminated by the soft flicker of candles that had burned low during the service. She moved quietly, collecting hymnals, straightening the altar cloth, doing the same humble things she'd done for years without expecting thanks. Yet tonight, there was something different in her movements, something softer, lighter. Perhaps it was peace, perhaps it was gratitude. At the back of the church, Victoria stood for a moment, watching her. She had stayed behind too, unable to leave just yet. The hum of the city outside seemed far away here, muffled by the calm that had settled in this sacred place. The same woman who once filled rooms with orders and sharp edges now stood in stillness, her eyes tracing the candlelight dancing on Grace's face. There was reverence in her expression, the quiet awe of someone who had glimpsed the divine not in miracles or grandeur, but in the steady kindness of an ordinary heart. Grace knelt near the altar and lit one final candle. The match flared briefly, a spark of warmth against the dim air before the flame steadied into a soft glow. She bowed her head and whispered, her voice low but firm, "Lord, let this light be for those who've forgotten what compassion feels like, for those too proud to ask for help and too hurt to forgive. Remind them that your mercy never runs out." Her words drifted upward, mingling with the faint scent of wax and lilies. Victoria's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to thank her, but something inside told her this wasn't a moment meant to be broken by words. Some things are better honored by silence. So she simply sat down on the nearest pew and let the quiet prayer wash over her. Outside, the evening breeze swept through the open doors, carrying the faint sounds of the world, the distant laughter of children, a car horn, the hum of life continuing. But inside the church, time seemed to pause. There was only the flicker of that candle and the gentle rhythm of two hearts that had once stood on opposite sides of pain, now beating in quiet harmony. Victoria closed her eyes and breathed deeply. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to control or explain anything. The world could turn as it wished. She was finally still inside. All the lessons she had learned, the hard, humbling revelations, came rushing back in fragments. Power without kindness is hollow. Faith without humility is noise. And forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about excusing the past. It was about freeing the heart to love again. Grace stood and turned, her eyes meeting Victoria's across the sanctuary. "You don't have to say anything," she said gently, as if reading her thoughts. "Just keep living what you've learned." Victoria smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple," Grace replied. "It's just not easy." They both laughed softly, that knowing laugh that comes only from those who have walked through fire and found something holy on the other. Sighed. Grace walked toward her, and the two women stood side by side, their reflections blending in the faint glass of the nearby window. Once, their worlds could not have been further apart. Now, they shared the same faith, the same hope, the same deep understanding that humility had done what pride never could. It had healed. Pride goes before destruction, but the humble find grace. The image of Grace's candle lingered on screen, glowing softly against the darkness. Sometimes, the voice continued, "It's not the miracles we can see that change us, but the quiet mercy that works behind the scenes. Faith doesn't always move mountains, it moves hearts, and when it does, even the coldest soul can find warmth again." Victoria and Grace walked out of the church together, stepping into the fading light. The evening sky was brushed with shades of purple and gold, the kind of sunset that made the whole world look forgiven. They didn't speak much on the way back to the car. Words weren't necessary anymore. Their silence was full of understanding. As they reached the steps, Grace glanced at Victoria and smiled. "You know," she said, "the real miracle wasn't that Ethan woke up. It's that you did." Victoria stopped, her breath catching. She nodded slowly, her smile small but genuine. "You're right. For years, I was breathing but not really living." She paused, her gaze drifting upward to the sky. "Now I finally understand what it means to be free." The streetlights flickered on as they walked away from the church, their shadows stretching long behind them. Grace held her purse close, humming softly under her breath, a familiar hymn that spoke of peace beyond understanding. Victoria listened, the melody wrapping around her like a gentle promise. Every note seemed to echo what her heart already knew, that redemption doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. Their footsteps faded into the quiet rhythm of the night. In the distance, the small candle still flickered through the church window, a tiny flame standing against the dark. Its glow seemed to follow them, as if heaven itself wanted to remind them, and anyone watching, that light doesn't have to be loud to change the world. Somewhere in homes filled with silence and hearts burdened by regret, someone might need that same reminder, that compassion still exists, that forgiveness is possible, that faith, even when bruised, still has power, and that grace is never out of reach. It's simply waiting for the moment a heart decides to open. If this story touched your heart, remember, faith can heal what pride destroys, love can rebuild what anger tears apart, and forgiveness, even when it feels impossible, can set two people free at once. The music swelled softly, the kind that feels like sunrise after a long night. The image returned once more to the small candle at the altar, its flame steady, unyielding, alive. Grace's earlier prayer echoed faintly in the background, as if carried by the air itself. Let this light be for those who've forgotten what compassion feels like. And then the screen began to fade, but the warmth of the story lingered. The lesson that healing doesn't always arrive in miracles or sudden revelations. Sometimes it lives quietly, in the changed heart of a once hardened soul. Sometimes it looks like two women walking side by side after a long journey, their past forgiven, their present filled with peace, and their future lit by faith. Pride builds walls, grace opens doors. And when humility walks in, even the darkest house becomes home again. As the music settled into its final note, the story left its mark, not as a sermon, but as a truth whispered straight to the soul, a truth that lives beyond the screen, waiting to be shared, to be remembered, to be lived. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of forgiveness, because sometimes one simple story of redemption can open a door that's been closed for years. And if you believe in the quiet strength of faith, in the beauty of grace, and in the justice that comes not from pride but from love, stay with us. There are more stories like this waiting to be told. Stories that heal, stories that humble, stories that remind us all. God still works in the hearts we least expect. The final image returned once more to the candle, its flame unwavering, steady against the shadows, before the light slowly dimmed to black, leaving only its glow imprinted in memory. If you've stayed with me until this moment, maybe something in this story spoke to you. A scene, a word, a small reminder that faith still reaches us in the quiet places. That's what these stories are meant for, to remind us that grace isn't distant. It's right here, working quietly in our everyday lives. If it moved you in some way, take a second to leave a comment below. I'd love to know what part stayed with you, what reflection it brought to your heart. It's your thoughts and experiences that keep this space alive, and they often inspire the next story we tell here. And if you felt a little lighter, or maybe just a bit more hopeful after watching, go ahead and click that like button. It helps this message reach others who might need the same reminder today. If you're new here, you can subscribe. It's free, but it means a lot. It's how you stay close to these stories of faith, redemption, and transformation we share every week. Each one carries a new lesson, a new spark of hope, a new way of seeing life through the eyes of grace. And before you go, there's another video waiting for you right here. It continues this same journey of forgiveness and second chances. Click on it and come with me there. Let's keep walking this path together, one story at a time.